Now that we've covered the Columbian exchange and the triangular trade with the first leg from Europe to Africa, the second leg from Africa to the Americas, and the last and final leg, the third leg from the Americas to Europe again, and we've talked about what goods were culturally diffused and different ideas and technologies and diseases that were culturally diffused. Now we're going to focus in on this second leg, on the middle passage. Okay, now this middle passage would take 6 weeks or longer, okay, to get from the western coast of Africa to the West Indies. You'll see that in this chart it shows that a majority of the population that was kidnapped from Africa was taken to the West Indies and the Caribbean, but also to Brazil, because remember the Portuguese controlled the Asiento being the name for the transatlantic slave trade system that emerged. Now, in this 6-week or longer passage from the western coast of Africa to the New World, approximately 50% of the people who were taken captive died along the way. So only about 50% actually made it to the plantations where they would be forced to grow various cash crops, notably sugar, in the Portuguese colony of Brazil, as well as in the Caribbean. Remember that those cash crops under mercantilism go back to Europe to make European mother countries rich, but they do not enrich the Americas, they do not really enrich Africa there. And also it somewhat enriches China by proxy because of all the silver that's being mined from the New World gets spent by the Spanish and the other Europeans in China for Chinese goods. Okay, so while slavery already existed in world history prior to the 1450s, the European slave trade to the New World is going to be particularly devastating. In Old World slavery, it was the lower classes that were captured to be enslaved, and it wasn't based on race, it wasn't hereditary, and it wasn't permanent, and it wasn't nearly as deadly. Okay, so originally it was prisoners of war, debtors, criminals that would be captured and sold as slaves, particularly along this eastern coast of Africa, or in the Byzantine Empire, or north of the Byzantine Empire, excuse me, in the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus in Europe used to be the biggest supplier of slaves until we see this trend over to Africa. Okay, now in New World slavery, in this European style, it's going to be much more deadly. It's going to be based on race. It's going to be hereditary, okay? And once the lower classes run out, or as we see the higher demand by the Portuguese for more people as they come back to the western coast of Africa, the lower classes are going to run out of people. They're going to run out of prisoners of war and debtors and criminals. And so the slave traders are going to start grabbing up anybody that they can capture, and this can include elites. So at first, prisoners of war, servants, criminals, and then any people who could be caught, including those who were at the top of the social hierarchy. So slavery in Africa prior to the transatlantic slave trade had been based on a cultural understanding of wealth. Community owned the land, okay, and those kinship-based networks, and they would divide the land up amongst people according to need, according to the size of the families. So how do you show wealth if you can't own land? Okay, so the way they showed wealth was by being able to support a large family, not just in terms of polygyny with multiple wives, but also in terms of being able to support slaves. And so owning people as property was a way to show wealth. But again, in Old World slavery, there was much less of a focus on working enslaved peoples to death, because that would not really reflect well on you as a sign of your wealth. Okay, so this is going to have a huge impact on the New World as we get a new population of peoples that contributes to the casta system, so that's a change over time, and as we see Old World slavery become eclipsed by New World slavery with its deadly implications in that as well. Okay, so this is just another picture of the triangular trade. Again, this first leg, leg one, the second leg with the middle passage with 50% mortality rate of the captured peoples, and then back from the New World to Europe with all of that wealth going to the mother countries under mercantilism. So we need to ask ourselves, why Africa? Okay, why did the Europeans enslave African peoples to bring over to the New World? Well, they had already enslaved the Native Americans. Okay, the encomienda system under the Spanish had converted the Mita system into a slavery system. But the issues that the conquistadors faced with this type of enslavement, in addition to the moral issues, was that there's a lot of land in the New World, but not nearly enough labor. Okay, because the natives had been wiped out by smallpox. If they wanted to escape, they knew the land and they had social networks to help them successfully escape. So why not focus on, if you can't get labor in the Americas, why not focus on labor from, say, Europe? Well, they did have a type of coerced labor system in Europe known as serfdom. Okay, but serfs, while they had very little rights, still had some rights. While serf lived on a vassal's land in feudalism, he would be entitled to food and shelter, and he would pay a large portion of whatever he grew back to the vassal lord. And they also gained protection from, raids and bandits along the countryside. Okay, so serfdom was not a viable choice for the type of intense, cruel labor that they had on the plantations in the Caribbean. Okay, and in Brazil. Indentured servants were people who chose.
Hey, Miss McNeely.
An indentured servant was somebody from Europe who wanted to come to the New World. Like I said before, they had a lot of land. Okay, so let's say that I am a person with very little wealth in Europe. Okay, which isn't far-fetched to think. So if I am a person with very little capital, right? But I want to get all the way to the New World to start my life. Well, I have to pay to get across the ocean, unless I find a noble or a lord who's already decided, hey, I'm going to go over to the New World and I'm going to start a plantation, I'm going to grow all these cash crops. Well, if I find someone like that and say, hey, you're going over there anyway, how about you pay for my ticket, right? And if you pay for my ticket, then I will work for you for a period of time, enter into a contract with you where I will basically be your form of free labor. But most of those indentured servant contracts ended after about 7 years or so. Okay, so again, not a great long-term plan for labor, and plus you also have to put up a lot of capital to get them over from the old world to the new world. Okay, and so indentured servitude was not as profitable an option. Okay. And so Africa became the new source for cheaper labor, the cheapest labor that the Europeans could possibly get. And this replaces the encomienda, because with the encomienda, the natives were dying off from smallpox and old world diseases. Okay, but the African peoples had already been exposed to old world diseases and thus had built up an immunity. Okay, so cause and effect. If we look at causation here, we're going to see that Africa goes through a very negative demographic effect. They have severe depopulation as a result of these slave raids, right? The majority of the people who are captured are going to be male, so you also have the effect of a larger female population in Africa than a male population. You also see that when the captured peoples in America are held prior to being sent across to the New World, they're going to be kept in barracoons. Okay, barracoons are quote-unquote slave castles. These are prisons or holding cells for captured Africans prior to the Middle Passage. So already you have a high mortality rate and you have high levels of cruelty prior to even passing through the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. Okay, you also see that this huge influx of African peoples into the New World changes up the social system. They change up the casta system. By 1800, by the 19th century, Africans make up the majority, or people of African descent make up the majority of Brazil's population, and then also they make up 1/5 of the U.S. population. So that just goes to show you the immense size of this change over time, the immense size of this Asiento. So I would recommend going into the Schoology page and reading this article that I've posted about a first-hand account, a primary source regarding the description of a slave ship. We have already covered in our lecture on the Americas the same topic, so if you want to review that, I'll have those videos posted. But now we're going to move on to the African diaspora. This is the dispersion of Africans out of Africa. And this isn't the only diaspora that we have in world history. We also have the Jewish diaspora, or the forced dispersion of the Jews out of Jerusalem. Okay, so this is the moving of people out of their homeland. Now, there are some stories of revolt along the Middle Passage, along that way, but it's there are some barriers to a united front against the slave captures and the slave raiders. For one, Africa can't be treated as a monolith. You can't just look at Africa and be like, oh, yeah, so they must have the same language and the same culture and the same foods. No, that'd be like if you look at the United States and say, oh, yeah, the Yankees are just like the Southerners. That is not the case, right? You have different aspects of culture, and one of those aspects is language. Okay, so the people who were captured didn't all share the same language. Now, they may have had roots back to the original language of the Bantu language from the Bantu migration, okay, but it is still very difficult and near impossible to communicate en route from Africa to the New World. It's very hard to stage a coup or to revolt if you can't communicate with your people in arms, right? And so this led to a forced isolation from culture, a cultural death, if you will. Most people that were forcibly moved from Africa to the New World lost their language after a generation. They were not able to pass it down to their descendants. You also see, because of the high mortality rate in Brazil and the Caribbean in particular, you don't have a very high reproduction rate in order to have children to pass down cultural aspects. Okay, but one of the consequences, one of the effects, okay, of this African diaspora is that in the Americas, a new language developed. Remember that cultural syncretism is when you combine aspects of different religions, or sorry, different aspects of culture. It could be religions, it could be language, it could be foods, and you combine them to make something new. So the new language that emerged from this time period due to the African diaspora was the language of Creole. This is the combination of European languages, so English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, to combine with Western African languages. And so this language of Creole is going to be the dominant language in the Caribbean islands especially. And if you've ever been to Louisiana, to New Orleans, you also see an influence of the Creole language there with the combination of French and English. Okay, now this is different from the Casta social class of Creole. The Casta social class Creole means a European person, or a person of European descent, who wasn't born in Europe. Instead, they were born in the Americas. Okay, so Creole has two meanings here. One, it is a syncretic language, and two, it is a level in the Casta system. We also have an example of syncretism in religion. Okay, now this is significant that in Africa they were predominantly Islamic due to the cultural diffusion of the trans-Saharan trade route with Islamic merchants. And so the arrival of Africans from the Old World to the New World was the first significant presence of Islam in the Americas. Approximately 10% of the people who were kidnapped and enslaved were Muslim. Okay, but we know that the mother countries were predominantly Christian, with most of them being Catholic, and so the New World is going to be dominantly Catholic. Okay, so Christianity is going to combine, there's going to be a combining of religious practice or beliefs with Western African traditions, and that's when we get the new religions of Santeria in Cuba, Vodun, although you may have also heard it referred to as Voodoo, and Candomblé. Okay, so you have this combination of mystical, magical, animistic, ancestor veneration type religion with the tenets of the Christian religion. One example here being the depiction of the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. That's known as the Madonna. So if you see Madonna, it doesn't just mean a singer from the 80s. Who represents the mother of Jesus. So whereas in European paintings from the Renaissance, they often depict Jesus as white and his mother as white, although he lived in Egypt for a large section of his life and he was born in the Middle East. Here, like you see with the Native American culture, the Native Americans combined their mother goddess with the idea of the Virgin Mary, okay, to depict the Virgin Mary as looking like them. And then the same thing is going to happen in these syncretic African religions that combine Christianity with their heritage back from the old world. So here we see a depiction of the baby Jesus and the Virgin Mother, okay, as reflected in their social system. Okay. Also, this halo, if you see a halo in pictures, it typically differs or refers to them as being holy. We also see the influence of music being spread from the Old World to the New World through the transatlantic slave trade. Music served a purpose in the New World for the people who were trying to survive enslavement. So this was a method of survival and communication. This allowed for some to endure the enslavement through camaraderie, through a communication network, and through a support system, but it also could be used as code to plan escapes. Okay, so you do have revolution and revolt against this system in the New World. We also have the invention of the banjo, which traces back to, again, like we saw with the 12-string kora that the griots use. And even today, we see the influence and the continuity of the impact of African culture in the Americas with gospel music, blues, jazz. So again, if you think about New Orleans, rock and roll, a lot of people think, oh, Elvis was the king of rock and roll. Well, rock and roll started in the African community before it became mainstream. And we see that with a lot of genres of music. Hip hop, samba, reggae, country music, okay, they all started with this African heritage. Also, another aspect of African culture that diffuses is food. So we have rice, okra, and the dish gumbo. So from these slides, you can see that African culture has had a profound and lasting impact on life in the Americas. Okay, a profound and lasting impact. So we still have those ties even leading up into the modern era. Okay, so overall, let's look at the causation. Let's look at the effects of the slave trade in Africa. And remember that when you talk about causation or any of the historical thinking skills, you can't just say there were many causes or there were many effects. You have to give specifics. So what were the social effects? What were the economic effects? What were the political effects? Well, in terms of demographic effects or social effects, we have imbalanced gender distribution in Africa. 2/3 of the population that was kidnapped were of the male gender. Okay, so this is going to have the biggest impact in Western Africa, where we see most of the slave trade occurring. So women are going to be stepping into that power vacuum. Even though it's still a patriarchal society, like every society we've talked about so far, women's status is going to increase as they start filling in the roles that are left empty due to the Asiento. You also see the increase in the marriage of multiple women to one man. This is known as polygamy. Okay, there aren't enough men left to go around, and so women women enter into relationships where there's one man and many women. Okay? African societies are going to participate in the slave trade at first because remember the definition of slavery in the old world is very different from what occurs in the new world. And remember that the Europeans are going to be bringing manufactured goods like guns and alcohol. So access or this influx of this weapon technology is going to have a very negative effect politically. It's going to lead to bloody regional conflict. Okay, especially when you think about how the demand for slaves by the Portuguese was so high that they start running out of prisoners of war and criminals and debtors, and so they start grabbing whoever they can, including the elites. Okay, and obviously that's not going to be good for the social stability or the political stability of a kingdom if they're in this bloody regional conflict in order to meet the demand for the Asiento. This slave trade is going to permanently weaken the Western African kingdoms. They are going to become dependent on European goods. So instead of manufacturing their own goods, instead they're going to rely on manufactured goods being imported from Europe. Okay, so what that means is that the Western African kingdoms especially are going to be slow to develop their own manufactured or industrial economies to produce their own goods. This is going to have the long-term negative effect, because remember, you can do short-term and long-term effects, of future European imperialism before World War I. Remember that old imperialism is the time period that we're in right now, where the Europeans imperialize the Americas. New imperialism, which is in period 3, the next period we're going to cover, is when the Europeans colonize Africa. Remember, they couldn't colonize Africa in old imperialism because Africa was too strong. They had the same weaponry, and malaria prevented Europeans from invading the interior of the continent. But with the discovery of quinine from the New World, that's going to be used as a treatment for malaria that is going to allow the Europeans prior to World War I to start the scramble for Africa, where they start imperializing the African continent. Okay, but one of the benefits of the Columbian exchange, that diffusion of goods and crops from the New World to the Old World, is going to be the improved diet that the African countries and kingdoms get through American crops. So you have the importation of corn and peanuts and manioc, which is like a potato, and cassava. Okay, so all of this is going to contribute to a diversified diet, more caloric value. That means less starvation. That means population boom. So even though the African communities are going to be very heavily depopulated by the Asiento, some of the crops from the New World do help to offset that extreme depopulation. And when we get to the next video, we're going to talk about the end of the Atlantic slave trade and the beginnings of the Enlightenment, with the ideas of natural rights like life, liberty, and property.